I'd like to introduce everybody to Brandon Smith. He was our speaker today. He has been a biologist and environmental educator with Brevard County for 25 years. In 2017, he joined the Natural Resources Department as an environmental specialist to help the then recently created Save Our Indian River Lagoon program. He has also served in leadership roles with many environmental groups, including the Florida Marine Science Educators Association, National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation, NOAA's Climate Stewards, and more. Throughout his career, he has been recognized for his dedication to environmental education and commitment to the environment, receiving multiple awards, including MRC's Paul Krogel Award for Outstanding Service to the Indian River Lagoon by a government employee. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we can't wait to hear what you have to say.
So, we're going to talk a little bit about the problems facing the lagoon and what we're doing to address that. Now, I'm not expecting you to read any of that up there. This is just sort of to show you that the pollution and impacts on the lagoon are very complex, coming from all different sources throughout our community. And it can be anything from industrial effluent, lawn chemicals and debris, muck that's out there, the septic system, sewage, stormwater, atmospheric deposition, agriculture, all of that plays a role in the pollution in the lagoon. And depending on what areas of the lagoon you're in, each of those sources can vary on how big of an impact they play. You'll hear a lot about agriculture in the southern end of the Indian River Lagoon, down around Lake Okeechobee, whereas here in Brevard, we don't have as big of an agricultural influence on the lagoon because we've developed a lot of the land that served as agriculture in Merritt Island and things. You'll still see some up in the northern ends of the county, around Mims and that area. There's still agriculture a little more influencing the area. But that just means that we have to have a very diverse plan as well to be able to address all of those different pollution sources. And if we look at the historical loading over the years of pollution, right, this is prior to the 90s here. And at that time, most of the pollution was directed at what we call point source pollution. It was coming from our wastewater treatment plants because they took the treated wastewater and discharged that directly into the lagoon. And while it's treated to reduce, the harmful bacteria and viruses and other things, remove all the solids, it still has a lot of algae feeding nitrogen and phosphorus in it. So the nitrogen that is going out there was one of the largest sources coming from those wastewater treatment plants. But then in the early 90s, they passed the Indian River Lagoon Act, and that changed a lot of things, right? And of course, we saw different various pollution sources. Now, stormwater runoff was another large pollution source as well. And that also kind of changed in the 90s as our focus went from just draining stormwater to prevent flooding to treating that stormwater before it went in the lagoon. So prior to the 90s, most of the stormwater structures were just meant to deal with flooding. After the 90s, then they had to install things like stormwater retention ponds, ways to treat it before it got out there. So if we look after the passage of the Indian River Lagoon Act, we saw a large drop in that point source pollution because those wastewater treatment plants were no longer allowed to discharge the lagoon. They had to do either deep well injection, some of them did reclaimed water or use spray fields and other ways to treat that water after it's gone through. So Vieira Wetlands is a good example of that, where they put it in these basins so those wetlands help treat it before the water goes anywhere else. So our point source pollution went down to just 1% of the pollution going into the lagoon. So that was a good improvement there. And of course, with those stormwater improvements, we saw that reduced as well. And the atmospheric deposition, so that is coming from our car exhaust and industrial exhaust getting into the rain and coming back down into the lagoon, that also dropped with the passage of the Clean Air Act and to clean up some of our air pollution. But we saw increases in other areas, mainly due to increases in population. So as we get more people in, we had more septic tanks installed, we're creating more muck from all our yard debris and grass clippings. And then we're getting more pollution in the groundwater from fertilizer, pet waste, and our reclaimed water. And that was a surprise to us earlier on when they were doing some groundwater studies, is we knew there was groundwater pollution coming from septic tanks, and we were looking at neighborhoods that had septic tanks, natural areas, and then areas with reclaimed water, and the reclaimed water areas actually had higher groundwater pollution than the septic tank neighborhoods. And the sewer, we also looked at sewer neighborhoods as well. So those were relatively low compared to the septic and the reclaimed water. So we knew we needed to address those as well. And in 2016, we put it to a vote and let the citizens decide. They passed the Indian River Lagoon half-cent sales tax, so the Save Our Lagoon tax, and that helped to fund these programs to reduce and remove pollution out there and help restore those natural habitats. So it's a 10-year tax and set to sunset next year. And that is a half-cent on anything that's sold in the county with sales tax. And it is set to generate about $586 million throughout the 10 years. So all of that goes into our various projects. So the initial plan that we designed was meant to reduce pollution by about 25% in what was coming into the lagoon, also remove 25% of that legacy load, that muck that was out there, while we're also restoring natural habitats. Now, when we first developed the plan, we were looking, estimated on what the school board was collecting in their half-cent sales tax. We thought we'd get about, a little over 300 million, 380 million over those 10 years, but sales actually went greater than we expected. So now that's why we're sitting at that 586 million. And we were able to respond and develop that plan to add things in. So we knew we couldn't just leave that plan static as is when we developed it in 2016. We knew it had to change. So every year we do an annual update where we can add in new projects, new opportunities, new technologies, and that has helped to increase the amount of pollution we've been able to remove. So we're now looking at about 35% nitrogen and 37% phosphorus removal from the pollution sources coming into the lagoon, as well as 29 phosphorus and 37% nitrogen from the muck that's out there. So we've been able to increase funding to those and add new projects in. And if you look at how that's all divided up, most of it is, or not most, but over half is going towards reduce. So all those pollution sources coming in, and the remove is that muck. So 37% for removing the muck. Now, unfortunately, muck's very expensive to deal with, so that's why it takes a large chunk, but it's also the largest pollution source in the lagoon. About 35% of the pollution comes from that muck as it decays and just releases nitrogen and phosphorus into the water. And then we have a 2% going to that restore and also to respond. So restore, it's a small sliver, but that's because a lot of those projects that deal with restoring habitat are a lot cheaper than some of these larger construction projects. And then the respond goes to our environmental outreach and monitoring of the projects to make sure they're all performing properly. And if you look at the breakdown of how that tax is divided up, so about, every $4 we get of local half-cent sales tax, we get about another $1 from tourists, and then a similar amount we're able to leverage in grant funds. So we apply for funds from state and federal grant agencies, and we've been able to collect, over 100 million in grants. And then we have our partners also putting in some of their own funds. So the way the Save Our Indian River Lagoon program works is we pay projects by the pounds of nitrogen they remove. And so there's a set amount of money for each pound of nitrogen, and anything above that, those partners, the county, the city, any of the other entities involved in those projects have to foot the rest of the bill if it goes over that. So some projects we're able to fund 100%, but a lot of times they have to put up their own funds, so they're putting an almost equal amount in their own funds as well. And so far, we have been able to remove or finish 111 projects throughout the county, and all you're gonna see on the next slide, these little dots, those are gonna be all the different project areas, but and it ranges throughout. So all the dots you see here are all those completed projects. So they go from the north to the south end of the county, spread all throughout. And that $586 million, we have 71% of that that's already either completed or underway. Right? So all of the money's been allocated towards projects, just some of these projects take time. Obviously, like our muck projects, we can't do them all at once because we need areas to pump the muck to. So we can only do so many of those projects all at once. And a lot of these projects also take time to plan. A lot of our sewer projects and things can take multiple years to get through just the permitting and design process. But we're trying to do as many as we can. In fact, we have about 101 projects that are currently underway right now. And those projects also are divided up throughout all the different entities, different cities throughout the county, and nonprofit organizations as well. And they're all doing their part to help the lagoon. And we also have homeowner projects. So we have grants that homeowners can apply for and help out. We'll talk about those a little later on individually and what those are, but we've done over 2,000 of those as well. And we, also look at the performance of those projects that I mentioned, and part of that respond. So we want to make sure those projects are doing what they're supposed to be doing, and we had to do groundwater monitoring throughout the county, as well as other monitoring of various projects. Now, you may have picked one of these up on the way in, so don't worry about having to read this, but if you didn't, on the back table, we have this brochure that's shown here. This is the inside. This is our annual report. So every year we put out this annual report that gives you the progress update, how many projects have been completed, how much money we've spent on that. And it runs the gamut of all different types of projects. We'll get into some details here in a minute, but anything from stormwater to sewer to habitat restoration, all of that's included. So the sewage treatment improvements that we're doing, we are working to improve many of the wastewater treatment plants. If you remember, I mentioned we were kind of surprised when we started doing the groundwater monitoring that the reclaimed water neighborhoods had even higher groundwater pollution than the septic neighborhoods did. So we knew we needed to address that in areas where it was a problem. So the way the wastewater treatment plants work, they're removing all of the bacteria and viruses and treating it for human health before that water is pumped out into that reclaimed water. But it does contain a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus. And they have a certain range that they're allowed to have with their state permits as how much nitrogen it can put out. And a lot of our plants were in an acceptable range. I mean, they all were within their permitted range, but most of them were within the range that typical grass would uptake if you're watering your lawn properly, not overwatering. So they say, depending on your grass, can take about 6 to 9 milligrams per liter of nitrogen. And a lot of our wastewater treatment plants were around, 9, 10 milligrams in that area. We had a few that were lower than that do advanced water treatment and around the 5 to 6 range. But we saw a handful of plants that were up in the teens and 20s. And while that was allowed within their permit, it was more than the grass can absorb. So that gets into the groundwater, causes that groundwater pollution, which then flows into the lagoon and causes algae blooms. So we knew we need to address that, and we have paid funds from that half-cent sales tax to put upgrades into these plants where they add extra filtration. They increase their holding times for the water and can increase the treatment. And in many cases, this also helps increase their capacity and has increased their rate that they can treat the water as well. So this added further benefits to helping to reduce overflows during storm events, hurricanes and tropical storms like we saw during Irene. Now, so that's helped out in many of our areas. And we also are looking at that, treating that water after it leaves the plant in different ways. So this is Long Point Park, and they have a small little treatment plant on site there. And we were able to add in a media around the outside we call BAM, bioabsorptive activated media, and just a fancy term for a filtration media similar to what you might have in an aquarium filter. So it provides area for good beneficial bacteria to grow that then treat that nitrogen in the water and remove it from the water as it passes through. So we're able to do this at some of the wastewater treatment plants that use these, what they call RIBs, rapid infiltration basins, or spray fields, where they're spraying that water out over a large field. We can put that media down into the sediment, and it helps treat that further before it gets to the groundwater. So we also realized that there are small wastewater treatment plants called package plants, often associated with mobile homes. And this is a package plant here. So it's a small building next to these mobile homes, and it treats the water on site and pumps it into this pond to settle out. But you'll notice water over here, this is the lagoon. So there's about a 10-foot berm between the lagoon and that settling pond of that package plant. And there were several storms that this got washed out and released that water out in the lagoon. So we knew this was not a good thing and needed to address those. So we are putting funding towards removing those package plants, putting sewer lines in, and connecting them to the main sewer system. And we also needed to address overflows that happen in the sewage treatment plants as well. And one of the main culprits of those overflows that happen during the storms is infiltration into cracks in the pipes. Those cracks could be, a manhole cover that's not sealed properly. It could be cracks in the main line, and cracks along the lines that run from the homeowner's house to the main line, what's called a lateral line. And in the case of the lateral line, that's the responsibility of the homeowner. The main lines are the responsibility of the utility. So one way to find those deficiencies that can allow water to flood into the system and overflow the plants during a storm is to do what's called smoke testing. So they take basically a modified lawnmower and connect up vegetable oil that's dripped onto the carburetor of the lawnmower. It sends a smoke out into the pipe. So it's a harmless smoke that then vents out of the pipes in the top of your house. You have a vent to the sewage pipe that comes out of the top of your home if things are running properly. If they aren't running properly, you'll see this, the smoke actually rising up out of the ground where there's a crack in the pipe. So when groundwater level is low, that means sewage can get out of that crack. When the groundwater is high during a storm, it means water can flow in and cause overflows. So either case, we wanted to get rid of those. So we found, a couple thousand deficiencies between homeowners and the utilities. The utility was responsible for fixing their own, and the homeowner, they're on the hook for fixing those, but we wanted to help them out. So we used half-cent sales tax money to provide grants to homeowners that had leaks identified by smoke testing, or even if they identified them on their own without us doing smoke testing, they can apply for this grant that then helps with the cost to repair that line. And in most cases, it covered the entire cost to repair that lateral line. So that's one way we can help reduce some of the sewage pollution out there. Now, while sewage treatment plants are an issue, and there's, I'm sure I'll get the question later. People often ask about spills and things, and as you remember, we talked about that point source pollution now being less than 1%, so that includes sewage spills. A bigger pollution source from sewage comes from septic systems, and this is the one we don't really think about because we don't see it. And many people think a septic system just treats the water completely once it leaves their home and it doesn't cause any harm. And while septic systems are good at getting rid of human health problems, bacteria and viruses, they aren't so good at treating that nitrogen and phosphorus. So traditional septic tank is just designed to hold the water to remove the solids and the fats, and then the water gets pushed out in your drain field, and that's where most of the treatment happens as the bacteria in the ground work on that sewage water and help to break it down some. But a traditional septic tank only removes 10 to 40% of the nitrogen pollution, depending how close it is to the groundwater, the type of soil it's in. And as you know, many of our soils here are very sandy. And it also depends, when those tanks were put in. We found some of these older tanks that were, sitting in the groundwater. They weren't separated. Now there's rules that they have to be a certain distance away. We found some old tanks that weren't even really a tank. They just had sand bottoms, so it was just seeping straight through. So a lot of old infrastructure that needed to be either, removed or upgraded. And so we looked at the septic pollution, and there's over 80,000 septic tanks in Brevard County, with over 60,000 of those being in the lagoon watershed. So feeding into the lagoon in one way or another. Now, some are going to provide more pollution than others, depending how close they are to a canal that feeds the lagoon or the lagoon itself. And also the type of soil and things that they're in depends on how much pollution they're putting out. And we looked at the various pollution sources and found out that 10% of the septic tanks were providing about 48% of that septic pollution. So we looked at the larger 10% and said, well, we need to remove those where we can. And we designed many septic to sewer projects where we remove the old tanks, run a sewer line into these neighborhoods that didn't have a sewer line before, and are able to connect those directly to the sewage treatment plant. And in areas where we can't do that, we're able to do a septic upgrade. So we can put in what's known as an ATU, an aerobic treatment unit, or some people call it an advanced septic tank. And this is a tank that adds in treatment in the tank. So it recirculates water through, it adds in aeration in different chambers. So it helps to start that biological process and remove some of that nitrogen from the water before it exits into your drain field. And we also found many areas that had a sewer line already, but weren't connected when that sewer line was put in. So we have grants available for quick connects to help those homeowners hook up. And we have grants available for homeowners to upgrade their tanks. So we have up to $20,000 we can offer homeowners to put in those advanced septic tanks where they can't connect up to sewer. And on our website, we have a map that shows you if you're in an area where you're eligible for that. It tells you how much your property's eligible for. If you go to our, we'll have QR codes for it later, and it's also in the literature that was put out. But go to our website at brevardfl.gov/saveourlagoon, go to the maps page, and we have a story map where you can look at the septic upgrade section, type in your address, and it'll tell you exactly what you're eligible for. You can also email us, and that contact information is also in that literature. And so IRL project at brevardfl.gov, and then we can help you out with that full application process. Now, I mentioned before, stormwater was another large pollution component too. So there's been a lot of stormwater improvement being done, like I said, since the 90s, but there's always new technology and things coming out that can be implemented, and our program has started to implement a lot of that throughout the county. So this picture here, you see almost looks like gravel. This is that BAM, that bioabsorptive activated media I was telling you about. And that is a mixture, depending on what we're using it for. It's different things that can be used, from wood chips to tire crumble, sand, clay, and they usually mix a few of those things together to create that filter for water to be treated. So this is one that is connected to a stormwater pond. You can just see a little bit in the background here. So as that water leaves the pond, it runs through that filter before it goes out into the stormwater system towards the lagoon. We've also worked with the state in helping to redivert some of those canals. So this is the M1 canal. They're just finishing up the last little bits of that project and getting that online to redivert water back towards the St. Johns River where it would naturally have flown in this area. So it would naturally have flowed back towards the St. Johns. And most of our canals that we put in are directed towards the lagoon. And they've been working now to identify what canals that they can redivert. And they did one already down in Palm Bay. Now they're working on the M1 and looking at others in the future to send some of that water back towards the St. Johns where there's a little bit more filter marshes to be able to treat it before it gets into the St. Johns River. And that helps to reduce the loading of pollution in the lagoon. And we can also put treatment into areas where there wasn't room before with newer technologies. So some of these older neighborhoods don't have room for stormwater ponds and things unless we were to buy out homes and then demolish them and put stormwater ponds in. So we can add some treatment in there. There's different technologies they can put underground with some of that filter material. And this is what's known as a baffle box. And the older baffle boxes just help trap sediment, but the newer ones, new technologies have come along to add in extra components. So here you'll see some screens. So those screens sit up above the water. As the water flows from the pipe through the screens first, it traps the trash, leaf debris, branches, things like that, all up in those screens and keeps it above the water level so that it doesn't decompose. And then the sediment falls down in below into that chamber, and then the water can flow back out. And in the newer baffle boxes, we've added, it's hard to see in this picture, but there's a little set of filter containers here that contain that BAM material. So it acts just like that fish filter. The water goes through there and is treated before it ends up leaving that baffle box. So a couple different ways to help treat that stormwater before it leaves. And they just are working on finishing up one in Melbourne. So they put the largest baffle box in the US and possibly the world up on Apollo Boulevard. So they just put that in, we were out filming it about 2 weeks ago. And so those can help in those instances where we can't get traditional stormwater ponds and things in. And one of the other things we added in later in one of those annual updates was vegetation harvesting. Now, this wasn't in the original plan, but we were approached initially by the city of Titusville, and they said, hey, we have these ponds that are stormwater treatment ponds, but they're not doing their job very well because they're overrun with vegetation. So you get things like cattails and then non-natives like hydrilla and water lettuce that can overload those ponds and keep them from being that filter that they're supposed to be. And traditionally, the way they used to treat those was just go out and spray all those plants, kill them all off with herbicide, and it cleared up the pond and allowed it to filter again. However, that kills off the plant, and that decaying plant then becomes muck and also releases nitrogen and phosphorus that's been stored, and that goes into the lagoon feeding algae blooms. So we didn't want to do that. And so we said, yeah, sure, we'll help you clean up these ponds with vegetative harvesting. So they can come in with either long-armed excavators, or this is what's called a weed-oo that drives down into the water and is able to scoop that vegetation up and bring it back in, kind of like a little aquatic bulldozer. And this removes that vegetation. It's then hauled off to the landfill and disposed of there. It can be used as a topping cover at night to help keep in the scent, keep the landfill from smelling too bad, or be put into the compost area of the landfill. So that's been a help in reducing the amount of herbicide that we've had to put out. And our natural resources department, their stormwater treatment has switched to almost exclusively using vegetative harvesting in all the stormwater ponds that they treat, right, and that they manage. So there's just a little bit of herbicide they use in areas that they can't get into with the equipment, but it's, fewer than 5 gallons a year that they're using. So it's been a great success to be able to convert to this harvesting. It's more expensive and time intensive and labor intensive, but it's definitely worth it to help the lagoon. And that muck. So I mentioned before, muck is 35% of the pollution out in the lagoon. So the largest source of pollution. And we knew we needed to remove this. Though those stormwater improvements we've been doing since the 90s have helped slow the production of muck. But we need to remove the legacy load that was already out there. And it gotten so bad in some areas that muck tends to settle into deep pockets, and that can be in areas where they've done excavation for the causeways. There are many borrow pits and things. They dug sand out in the lagoon and created the earthen parts of the causeway. Some of the islands out there, all of those things, were from things dug up in the lagoon in the channel. So the muck would settle into the channels, it'd settle in those borrow pits, but in many of those areas, it was filled to the top and overflowing into the rest of the lagoon. Now, muck not only releases nitrogen and phosphorus, but it has no oxygen in it, so plants and animals can't live in it. So our seagrass and all our little bottom-dwelling animals like clams and snails and other things can't live in that muck. So they take a barge or a boat out with basically a big vacuum head and are able to suck up the muck, and then it's piped into a dredge material management area. So this was the one I think out at Turkey Creek, and it's right near R.J. Conlin. There's this large area with these big berms. They pump the muck up into there, and they drag it up onto the sides of the berms for it to dry out, and then the water seeps out over a little weir and back into the lagoon. And that muck is then hauled off and taken, in many cases, it's brought to agricultural lands that can use it as a fertilizer since it is very high in nitrogen and phosphorus. It is tested for any toxic substances, heavy metals and things. And if it does test too high for those toxic substances, then it would go to the landfill to be disposed of there. And you may be familiar with the Ogali muck or the Pineda muck dredging site from Grand Canal. And that area, it wasn't large enough to do this type of dewatering, so they pump it into bags instead. And these bags trap the muck inside but let the water flow through. And then those bags, once the water's pushed out of it, they can cut those open, put them into dump trucks and haul it off. Now, that helps to get rid of the muck itself, but we wanted to go one step further with the muck removal because we know that the water that then is decanted off of that muck is also high in nitrogen and phosphorus. So in many cases, we are doing what's called interstitial water treatment, and we're doing this out at that Grand Canal site. So after that water leaves those bags, the muck is out of it. It then goes through a process similar to treating your drinking water. And they use that to remove nitrogen and phosphorus before that cleaner water is pumped back out into the Indian River Lagoon. So it wasn't required by our permits, but we wanted to do one extra step to help make sure that we are putting the cleanest material back to the lagoon as possible. We also, as I mentioned, are doing habitat restoration. So we've done shoreline plantings at MRC and other areas throughout the lagoon. We've helped to fund oyster and clam restoration as well. So we work with commercial clammers. To each commercial clammer, we give them money to put out an extra 500,000 clams onto their leases than they would normally. And these clams help to filter the water while they're growing up. They also trap nitrogen and phosphorus into their shells and their bodies. And then when they harvest those out for food, those are removed out of that nitrogen and phosphorus and removed from the system. And then they can keep that process rolling. And the Brevard Zoo, they have a clam project that they're doing that works with homeowners as well. So that one's not funded by us, but they are working with clams too. We do help fund some of the oyster projects the zoo is doing. And this is a project not done by the zoo, but one that was done by Cocoa Beach out at McNabb Park, where they're putting in these gabions that are basically boxes containing mesh, wire boxes containing oyster shells, because oysters prefer to settle on existing oyster reefs, other oyster shells. Tells them it's a good area, so we kind of trick them into thinking this is a good reef site, and they're able to settle on those oyster shells in there, and eventually they'll grow out of that box and cover the whole thing, create a little oyster reef. And we have worked with Brevard Zoo with their oyster gardeners as well to kind of monitor the oyster spat, that's little babies floating around in the water, and look at natural recruitment in areas. So we have oyster gardeners that hang cages off of their docks to help grow oysters that are then put into some of these cages before they go in the water to seed those cages with some extra oysters. And they also have an extra shell on top to look at oysters settling naturally in there. And we've seen through that monitoring that as we put these oyster reefs in, we have mainly had natural recruitment in the southern end of the county, and that's been inching further and further north as we put more and more of these oyster reefs in. So that's a good thing to see, that we're spreading that natural recruitment as well to help restore some of those oyster reefs. We also have programs for education and outreach. So we talk to groups like we are doing here. We go out to festivals and different events. So we'll be at IRL Day down at Front Street Park in October, on October 18th. And we have our Lagoon Loyal program as well. And Lagoon Loyal is our outreach education component that we try to get our citizens to help reduce pollution before it gets into the water. So it costs a lot more money to treat that pollution once it's in the water than it does to stop it at its source. And there's a lot of simple things homeowners can do to help with that pollution. Some do require some investment, but many of them have very little cost associated with them. Right? So it might be something as simple as making sure your irrigation system's running properly. They're not watering the roadway and creating more stormwater, or making sure you pick up after your pet, stuff like that. A big thing to help reduce that muck is to blow your grass clippings off of the roadways and driveways and back into your lawn. Not only does it create a natural fertilizer for your lawn to reduce the amount of fertilizer you need to use, but it keeps it from getting in the stormwater and becoming muck. Also remind people, especially this time of year, is people are trimming up for hurricane season and making sure they have all their branches and palm fronds cut down, to make sure that you put those into a receptacle, or if they're picked up directly on your driveway, that's great, but we want to make sure we don't stack them on or in front of those storm drains where they can wash down. I've seen this many times where people just put them right on top of those grates. Another way you can help to make sure you're not overwatering and creating more of that groundwater seepage is to do what's called the tuna can test. So you take a small can, like a tuna can or a cat food can, you put 10 of those or so out in your lawn, spread throughout your fertilizer or your irrigation zone. And that then you turn your sprinklers on for about 15 minutes, let that run. And as that runs, you turn it off and then measure the amount of water inside of that can. And you're looking for about 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch for your irrigation cycles. So if you measure it and in 15 minutes it's 1/2 inch, then your irrigation's set about right. If it's say 1/4 inch, then you need to run irrigation for about 30 minutes in order to get that 1/2 inch amount. If it's over that, then you need to reduce the time that you run your irrigation. So that can help to keep that fertilizer from getting pushed down past the root zone and down into the groundwater. Same with the pet waste, that any of that is left on your lawn, it keeps that from getting in there, but it's best to pick up that pet waste out of your lawn to keep that from happening to begin with. But those are, simple things you can do. And of course, you can go to, other things like installing smart irrigation systems with timers and making sure you have a water sensor, anywhere up to installing those advanced septic tanks, which, as I mentioned before, we can help with funding that as well. And we also do have our fertilizer ordinance. So right now we are in the ban period for applying fertilizer with nitrogen. Now, year round, you can't apply any phosphorus in your fertilizer, but nitrogen's prohibited from June through September. And that's because it's typically our rainier season. We don't want that washing out. But coming soon in October, people are going to start to be able to fertilize again. We recommend people, be careful how much you apply. And if you can, reduce or eliminate it entirely. You can even get a soil sample test done at the Brevard County Extension Office. It costs about $10, and they will tell you exactly what you need. A lot of times, what a lawn's lacking isn't necessarily nitrogen. It can be a mineral that's, potassium or magnesium, something that it needs and can just be added on its own instead of doing a wide spectrum fertilizer. And if you are going to fertilize, make sure that it doesn't have any phosphorus. So that's that middle number on the fertilizer bag. And it also contains at least 50% slow release nitrogen. Now that takes a little more math to try to figure out. So we do try to help you out with that. We have signs in all the stores. They're required by the ordinance to have these up. And there's a little QR code on those signs. They scan that, you can scan the QR code and it'll tell you what brands of fertilizer have that 50% slow release. So you know which ones are compliant with our ordinance. But like I said, reducing or eliminating it entirely is best. But if you are fertilizing, also if you are near water, whether it's the lagoon or a drainage canal, anything like that, you want to keep a 10 to 20 foot buffer zone. Now it says 10 to 20 feet because the rules are different depending on what city or if you're in the unincorporated areas of the county. So each one has kind of a different range. But those are just a good reminder as we get into that fertilizer season. If you are going to fertilize, make sure you're doing it properly. And those signs in the stores reiterate a lot of that, tell you what you should and shouldn't do. And you can sign up for our newsletter as well. So we have a monthly newsletter that if you go on our website, you can sign up there, or this QR code will send you there as well. And we give you progress updates of different projects. We usually highlight a project in each newsletter. We also provide opportunities for volunteering. So we list anything from the Marine Resources Council's events to all the other different volunteer groups that are helping the lagoon. So you can go on there and give you a little reminder of what's coming up. And you can go to that Lagoon Loyal website, lagoonloyal.com, or just at that QR code, and that will give you those tips and tricks that you can do around your home to help the lagoon as well. So with that, I'll take questions.
Thank you. So if you're in-house, Cara will be collecting the note cards with the questions, and we do have some coming in online as well. Okay. So question about baffle box maintenance. How often do the screens need to be cleaned and how much work is involved in the cleanings?
Good question. So the baffle box maintenance is going to depend on each baffle box. Some collect more debris than others depending where they're located. But typically those screens are vacuumed out once a month. So they have a large, looks like a dump truck kind of, and it has a big hose that comes off, and the worker is able to maneuver that hose inside of the manhole covers in the top and vacuum out those screens. The sediment that settles in the bottom, those are cleaned out usually about once a year before they fill up too much. And so that's the maintenance involved with that. And it's, not too labor intensive unless they get some strange things in there the vacuum truck can't pull out. And that does happen from time to time. Melbourne was just telling us they had, I forget how many, but I think it was over 10 propane tanks show up in one of their baffle boxes. I don't know how they got in there, but they showed up in there. One time an entire palm tree was in one. So those require a little more work to get down in the box and remove those because the vacuum truck obviously can't get those out.
Are there any new water treatment plants being built to match population growth?
that would be a question for the utility department. They've been talking about a new one up in Port St. John. But I am not sure on their plans for other ones.
Okay, let's see here. We have a question for clarification or repeating the link mentioned for that shows the plans for septic system removal and upgrades.
Yes. Yeah, so our website is brevardfl.gov/save our lagoon. Or if you just go to the county's main website, there's a little picture of a manatee. You click on the manatee and that takes you over to our Save Our Lagoon page. And then from there, you want to go to the maps section. So there'll be a little bar on the side, a menu bar on the side. You click the maps and our story map is on there. So that has all the different projects, and you want to go to the septic upgrade section and there'll be a search bar. You type your address in, or just email us at irlproject@brevardfl.gov and give us your address when you email us, and we can look it up for you too.
And then a question about kind of progress shown in different zones with septic conversions. Is that on that as well? How can users or county citizens track progress for these different projects?
Yeah, so for the septic to sewer, so on that same Indian River Lagoon page, on the menu bar on the side, so I mentioned the map section, there's also one for septic to sewer. So if you click on that sewer link, it'll take you to a page that talks all about our septic to sewer program. And if you scroll down to the bottom, it gives you the update of each one of the projects that's in progress and where they are in that, whether they're under design, how much design, when it's expected to be done with design. We list all that on there to help give those kind of updates. And we also have a quarterly report that we do. Right? So we have a monthly meeting we do every month. It's the third Friday of every month at 8:30, and it's held in the government center on the third floor of Building A in the Florida room. But it's also streamed on our Facebook page, on our YouTube channel, and on Space Coast Government TV. So you can watch it live on all of those, and it's also archived on those sites. So you can go look at recordings as well if you can't watch it live. And we give monthly progress reports, which those monthly progress reports are also posted on our website. So you'll see those under our project plan section. Or actually, the Citizen Oversight Committee section has our monthly progress reports. Under the project plan section, we have our quarterly reports. And those quarterly reports give the progress and percentage complete of those different projects as well. And we present that every 3 months at those monthly meetings. So we just had one of those in August. So the next one will be in November.
So the lagoon runs through many counties. Are there other areas where there might be similar efforts? And is there a way of kind of showing the outcomes of projects like outside of Brevard?
Yeah, so the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program, they oversee projects throughout the 5 counties. They also have grants available, and we apply for those as well to help with our projects. And they collect information on the projects that have been done throughout the counties. And they have an annual report that they do with that. So that helps to keep track of what's going on in the other counties. And each of the counties is funding that restoration differently. So we have the asset sales tax, others are putting, direct taxes on their citizens. But each one has different funding mechanisms, and they're all, trying to do a little something to help the lagoon.
We have a couple of questions about especially large apartment complexes or buildings going up in terms of what problems they could cause, and like this. Yeah, so I mean, what's to be expected to come with property developments?
So of course, large apartment complexes means more people, more cars and exhaust and other things. However, it does reduce the amount of urban sprawl, so you're not getting as much pollution from, all these lawns that are fertilizing and, having septic tanks and other things. So you'll have a centralized area, hopefully connected to the sewer line. And there's also been new stormwater regulations the state just passed this year. And those new stormwater regulations are strengthening, what new development has to do to, help clean up as they put new things in.
Yep, that was a question about the effects of the stormwater rule on different projects. So thanks very much about that.
Yep.
Can you talk about the impact of the commercial space industry at all on our efforts, both positive and negative?
Yeah. Unfortunately, we have no control over the federal lands. They are supposed to be, following rules and working on helping the lagoon. We do know that there is, nitrogen things produced in just the process of sending off rockets, so that can add into that atmospheric pollution that can then rain down in the lagoon. So there can be impacts there, to what extent, I don't know. There's been a few things trying to look at how much is generated, but those are relatively new areas that they're looking in the impacts of that. And so we have submitted comments to, they had a public comment thing, and the Save Our Lagoon plan did put comments in on how we would like to see, various monitoring put in place to see the impact and judge, what's done by that monitoring.
Perfect. I found the other high rise. Are there ECA or regulations on large home building communities, new high rises within the county?
I would know that's something that, our planning and building departments handle.
I'll answer that and say no. We do not have a county-wide low impact development policy or development ordinance. Okay. So is survival, I think this has to do when you're talking about the oysters, and how is the survival of our native aquatic wildlife change when they are placed in polluted areas to do filtering, or what I guess goes into site assessment?
Yeah, so we have looked at, and we actually have a model to kind of address the suitability of where oysters can go. And so anyone who's doing oyster work can use that model and look at if certain sites are better than others. And we've, sometimes it's trial and error. What seems like it might be a good site, we found, we put an oyster reef in, and maybe there was more sediment that gathered in that area than we expected, and it kind of buried that reef some and caused problems. But for the most part, our reefs have done great. We've seen growth on them of the oysters that were placed there. We've seen recruitment of new oysters, and we've seen bridging and connecting of those oysters as they grow. So most of the reefs have done well. There's been a few problem ones here and there, but it's just a handful that we had issues with. And if there's issues, then they're removed and reevaluated on whether they can be put back in place with modifications or whether it just needs to go into a different site.
Let's see here. So this goes back to I think this is wastewater treatment plants. What happens to solids? I assume this is a biosolid question.
Yeah. So yeah, those biosolids, that's a thing every county deals with, and how to get rid of those. And some of them will put them out in these like fields to kind of dry and decompose out there. Others truck them out of their counties to be disposed of somewhere else. There's certain times when they can use them on various agriculture that's not going to be consumed by people, obviously. Milorganite, the fertilizer you can buy in the store, that's made from biosolids. So there's different things that they can do with those solids. But yeah, it all varies depending on the treatment plants.
Have y'all considered any sort of promotion, essentially to encourage property owners, homeowners to do some of the things with irrigation, fertilizers, that are better for our environment?
Yeah, so our Lagoon Loyal program, up until August, we did have an incentive program with that gave people coupons for doing these actions and reporting them back. And so they were able to earn points and then turn those in for coupons at businesses around the community. We weren't seeing a lot of participation. There was some, but it wasn't as much as we had hoped. So we're working on revamping that right now and working in new incentives. So we had started to do a few new things, doing more like giveaways of, some nature adventures like a paddleboard trip or bioluminescent kayaking trip, things like that. And that got a little more engagement. So we're looking right now how to revamp that. We're working with a group that's put out surveys to the public to see what they would want and what incentivizes them to do these actions. And we'll be rolling out a new incentive program with that Lagoon Loyal. So it's in the works. So there was incentives, it just wasn't being utilized the way we had hoped. So we're working on incentives that will generate more impact.
Does or how does the collection of the half-cent sales tax impact municipalities and their stormwater spending, their own stormwater tax spending and projects?
Yeah, so each municipality has their own stormwater fees that they assess, and ours is independent of that. But we've been told, by providing money from the Save Our Indian River Lagoon tax towards stormwater to these municipalities, they've been able to then do more projects than they were able to before they had ours to supplement that. So they're able to, in many cases, if a project was going to cost so much, $10 million to do, and our program was going to cover 8 million, then they take that 8 million that's covered by our program and can put that into a different project. So they still have to put that money that they save towards other stormwater, improvements.
Can they use that as matches too through soil for bigger projects?
Yeah, so we don't require a match in our program because we are paid based on the nitrogen removal, but they can use their own money and our money as matches for federal grants and state grants. But in many cases, those do have a match requirement. So they're able to then use that money and then increase the amount they can get from outside grants.
Where can people access the annual budget?
The annual budget? So our, plan we do a monthly report on all our spending, and we also do those quarterly reports, and those are all put onto our website. So that brevardfl.gov/saveourlagoon. You go to the project plan page, it has the most recent quarterly financial report that has all the projects in there and how much money is allocated to them, how much has been spent. It's all listed on there on the website. And we also have an annual audit that we do. We just went through that process and we'll be presenting that audit later in the fall at one of our public meetings.
Okay, now this is a double one. What is the status of the half-cent sales tax? And I assume this means 2026. And then what happens if that doesn't get renewed?
So we have a list of projects in our plan that are unfunded projects as well. So we have, whenever we've been able to get more money, whether it's through grants or increased sales tax collections, we've been able to then chip away at some of those listed projects. And we also have an annual application process for people to apply for those new projects. But so needless to say, we can definitely fund more projects if we had more money. As of this point, we do not know what the status will be as far as whether they will attempt to renew the tax in 2026. So the previous commission had a meeting on it and said they were going to let the new commission coming in decide what they want to do and how they wanted to do a renewal. So we are just waiting on direction from the board on, you know, how they want to do that renewal. Until then, we can't move forward with plans for any future projects. We'll still be spending the money collected in the 10 years, several years past the end of the collection, because as I said, it takes time for those projects to happen. So we'll be plugging away on those projects. If there is a renewal and it does pass, then we will have many more projects to add in.
Last question, are you willing to share your slides?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect, I'll get in touch with that person. And I will say that this has also been recorded, and we'll have it on MRC's YouTube channel in the next day or two, if you want to share it out or view it again or review it for any information. That is all of our questions, so thank you for wonderful questions, thank you for wonderful information, and for everyone being here today.